Hello everyone, welcome to this talk on artificial chemistries. I'll be presenting joint work with Professor Banzaf on our recently released book about artificial chemistries. So after a brief introduction to the field, I will focus on what's more related to my research topic, which is computing with artificial chemistries. And then I will introduce our software package that comes with the book and that is intended to facilitate people to program their own artificial chemistries. Artificial chemistries can refer to systems that are made with wet chemistry, but they can also refer to systems that are simulated in the computer in which molecules or objects are like letters or strings, binary strings, or numbers or graphs or anything that can have an interaction that looks like a chemical reaction in which other molecules are produced or other objects are produced in ways that do not necessarily comply with the rules of chemistry, but in which you can say that there are some transformation of objects that look like chemical reactions. Artificial chemistry started as a spin-off of artificial life, life as it could be, to explore phenomena such as the emergence of life from inanimate chemicals. However, quickly it became apparent that there were many more applications of artificial chemistries, like ranging from physics to the emergence of language to music composition, artificial composition, to modeling economies, like how novelty can be produced in economies. As examples of wet artificial chemistries, here today we will discuss a little bit more about the molecular automaton, which is a way to implement finite state machines with DNA. This is an example where a slime mold finds its way out of a maze by following gradients of nutrients. This is an example of self-propelled oil droplets, where droplets can move around and dance and do interesting things that have some, let's say, sensor and cognition abilities, some very primitive ones. And here is an example of a protocell that it's made of micelles that have some genetic material on top of it and not in the interior as we have seen in conventional cells. Artificial chemistries can be divided into well-mixed or spatial chemistries. In well-mixed, every molecule has the same probability of encountering every other molecule in the system, whereas in the spatial system you can have molecules that move around according to some laws of physics or in a two-dimensional, three-dimensional space, and that they can move from one compartment to another and so on. Another distinction in artificial chemistries is between constructive and non-constructive systems. A non-constructive system, for instance, here is the repressilator, in which three genes repress each other in a chain, in a cyclic manner, and it has been shown that this circuit exhibits oscillations of repressor protein concentrations, but the number of different molecular species does not change in the system. In contrast, a constructive chemistry, like the matrix chemistry, in which the molecules are binary strings that fold into matrices that multiply each other, in this system, like you can show that suddenly new molecule species emerge, but then they die out and get extinct and so on until maybe a core of molecular species survives that forms a closed and self-maintaining organization. So organizations are an interesting aspect of constructive chemistries that can be studied. Although the system could explore a whole range of possibilities, it ends up in a kind of state, steady state that is the organization. Some components of an artificial chemistry. When designing an artificial chemistry, we have to take three elements into account. First is what kind of molecules are needed in the system, what kind of reactions will happen between these molecules. And when you look at a molecule, how can you determine what kind of reactions will happen? And for that, we need also an algorithm that applies the reaction rules to the molecules. the algorithms, depending on the granularity from individual molecules to very large amounts of molecules, or whether the system is well mixed or spatial, then we choose the algorithm like, would you like to take into account the stochastic effects, or on the other hand, would you like to look at the system from a macroscopic perspective and look at the system from an ODE or PDE point of view, the ordinary differential equations which are integrated deterministically. Here, in terms of computing with artificial chemistries, then first of all, I would like to highlight that the cover page of our book actually represents a ribosome. So it's artistic representation of a ribosome. And ribosomes are nice examples of how sometimes concepts from computing can be found deep inside living systems. The ribosome is like a machine that reads the messenger RNA sequence like a tape and produces a protein out of it. It has been compared to a Turing machine operating on a tape, or rather two tapes in this case representing the messenger RNA and the proteins that are produced. Based on this, many ideas have arisen on how it would be possible to compute with molecules, such as the artificial molecular machines by Lane, so a very ancient system where two molecules could bind to each other and one molecule would operate on the other, following a set of instructions like machine code instructions, or the enzymatic Turing machine by Bennett, in which an enzyme would operate on the symbols of a tape and then could do it so reversibly, so it could go forward and it could also undo the operations going in the other direction. So it was one early form of reversible computer. Today we see a revival of reversible computing after it has remained dormant for quite some time. So now there is a renewed interest because we want to save energy. And we know that with reversible computing, at least theoretically, it's possible to build computers that consume much less energy. So I think this is one of the potential fields where a lot of contributions of artificial chemistries could be done. So when computing with artificial chemistries, we necessarily have to deal with emergent phenomena. So one of the interesting things that the ribosome example reminds us of, is that actually computing occurs in nature. It has not been invented by humans. It occurs in nature as a natural process and a self-organizing process. So to harness this, we need to understand how to engineer and control self-organization, which is the theme of this track. So actually, I think artificial chemistries then are a very nice example of why we really need to learn how to engineer and control self-organization. So computing with artificial chemistries is a form of emergent computing. So we have to take into account how the properties at high levels emerge from lower levels, like how the molecular collisions in the microscopic scale can impact the dynamic of the system at the macroscopic scale. So there is no way around this emergent aspect and self-organizing aspect in the chemical computing. As an example, I will turn now into the molecular automaton by Benison and Shapiro. This is the implementation of a finite state machine using DNA and enzymes. As a proof of concept, the authors have implemented a very simple finite state machine with only two states and two possible input symbols. I think possibly the simplest possible. The ingredients are the DNA tape with the input symbols encoded as short segments. So you have the DNA tape encoding both the initial current state of the system plus the set of symbols that are going to be read in sequence. And then there is an enzyme that is loaded with DNA fragments and that will bind to these sticky ends here in determining the transitions. Here's how, for instance, a bunch of enzymes would all compete for binding to the current sticky end that determines the current state and current symbol to be read. Only one of these, or a number of identical enzyme complex configurations, have the strand that matches by complementarity perfectly so that it produces a stable complex with the DNA. And then after binding to the DNA, the enzyme cuts the DNA at exactly the same number of nucleotides downstream from the binding site. It cleaves like scissor. And then after that, it releases the portions that can be then recycled later for later use. And then another enzyme can bind to the next sticky end that has been exposed and match it again, and so on, doing the same kind of computation until a terminator is reached. The terminator symbol is cleaved, and then it exposes the final state of the machine. If the final state is S0 in this case, for instance, it means that the input string of symbols has been accepted. And if the final state is S1, for instance, it means that it is rejected. So this is an example of where we had a lot of competing molecules to compete to bind here, but at the end we have always the same result. So in spite of the stochastic nature of the system, we still can have a deterministic outcome. The authors have envisaged a potential, let's say, hypothetical application for this system, which would be a DNA doctor in a cell that would be able to diagnose a disease by saying yes when the cell is ill, for instance, and no when the cell is healthy. Of course, in the real implementation of the system, it would be much more complicated because much more molecules would be available there, and more stochastic effects would have to be taken into account. And that's one of the reasons why the system is still not available today, but remains like still a hypothetical application. But I think it's a good example of how this could be used somehow. And I would also like to highlight that there is a computer simulation available for this system, that someone has implemented a computer simulation which looks like the system we have seen before, like it is the two DNA strands that hybridize together, exposing some sticky end, and the reactions between them that could lead to the enzyme complex binding to the input DNA tape by complementarity and then cleaving and so on. But I will not go into the details of the chemistry, just to say that very similar concepts can be implemented both in wet chemistry and in simulation with the computer, which is. And also a second example why I mentioned the molecular automaton example is that it also a little bit similar to a system we worked with in the past when I was at the University of Basel. I worked with a programming language inspired by chemistry, Fraglets language, in which we had rules that were like program instructions that were encoded at the head of the molecule, so only the head that is exposed is going to be processed. For instance, by matching, these symbols could match and then expose the rest of the string. The head is consumed and discarded, recycled, as we did before with the DNA final state machine, and then the rest is sent to the other node, for instance, to implement a communication protocol. So this is just to show that also from very different domains you can have different solutions that look a little bit similar and that have a lot of common aspects in the programming with the chemistry. So somehow trying to extract what are the basic principles of programming with chemistry, although we still don't have that set of basic principles yet. And we have worked on the automatic evolution of communication protocols using this language. Another example I would like to mention with respect to chemical computing is computing with reaction diffusion. This is another example where it's possible to compute both with the simulation in the computer and also in real wet chemistry. For instance, these are examples of reaction diffusion computers by other researchers. For instance, the computation of Voronoi diagrams using reaction diffusion. So the chemicals react, the chemicals diffuse first, and then they react here when they meet at the border, and then they form a precipitate. Precipitate goes down, so the chemicals cannot diffuse anymore, so they form these shapes, these borders that look like Voronoi diagrams. This is another example where a light-sensitive Belousov-Zhabotinsky reaction has been used for image processing. At the beginning, you don't have anything visible, and then you have like contour of an image that was put underneath the system, so it can appear there as a kind of reaction that does some image processing with the chemistry, which was quite novel at that time, so it was a long time ago. And one of the things I explored in my research was the evolution of decentralized algorithms for computer networks, and in this case it was like a cluster head election in a sensor network, using a GPU hardware for that to be able to evolve large populations of individuals, which each individual is a large grid of reaction diffusion chemicals inside. So now for the software package. This is a software package that is different, a little bit different from the others, because we would like to give the people opportunity to program their own artificial chemistries. Most of the packages around that we see so far in artificial chemistries, they implement a specific artificial chemistry, while here we would like to offer a whole range of chemistries and let people maybe create their own chemistries out of a basic system, like bags of objects and basic implementations of reaction algorithms in cell compartments, reaction diffusion, and so on. So I will give here an example. So the easiest example is the Lotka Volterra simple ecology, where rabbit eats the grass and reproduces, fox eats rabbit and reproduces, and the fox dies. And then you can, just by setting the flag, like would you like to use stochastic simulation or not? Here's stochastic simulation, here's this like ODE integration. You can obtain then by setting some concentration of substances, you can then integrate the system and obtain like the ODE result, which is smooth oscillations, or the stochastic result, which is more stochastic noisy effects that you can see here. This is for a very small volume for the same concentration. Here we deposit some concentration amount. For the same concentration, a small volume means less molecules, so we see more stochastic effects. Now another example is the molecular traveling salesman problem, the solution to the TSP problem using an artificial chemistry. So this is also an early system, so just briefly on the travel salesman problem. So this is about how to compute a tour that visits all cities on the map only once in the minimum tour. It's known to be NP-hard problem. And the solution using the molecular TSP is based on machines and tours. The tours are the list of cities in the order that they are visited, and we just generate a random set of tours and let some machines operate on these tours. The machines actually look like genetic operators that swap random cities or cut segments or invert segments, recombine segments, so they look a little bit like the enzymes in the DNA FSM example, in which enzymes are cutting the DNA strand. So here we could imagine that enzymes also operate on these tours that are like DNA strands. And then starting with the chemical soup of random tours, the machines can, a population of machines of these types, many machines of each type, can operate on tours in parallel, drawing molecules and performing operations and evaluating the cost of each tour, which tour has the minimum cost, and then you discard the tours that have a high cost. And this progressively leads to a selection of best tours. Here, starting with a population of random tours with a high cost, we reach a configuration that is close to optimum. This is the Python code for that, part of it at least. Just the main parts, it's just like create random molecules, they inject them in the soup, and then put the machines in the soup as well. The machines are injected together in the same system, where you have rules that exchange or cut tours. So So these rules are also encoded as molecules, are strings in a mode set, and they are injected there for being operated upon. So iteration, after several iterations, we can pick the best molecule, and this will be the result of the computation. Another example is the Gray-Scott reaction diffusion example. So this is a very simple system where you have only two chemicals, an activator that consumes a substrate and reproduces, and both chemicals decay, and the substrate has to be injected periodically because it is consumed by the activator. Here you have the system of partial differential equations that result from this system of reactions. But actually in biochemistry you don't need to look at the differential equations directly. The implementation just looks at the chemical reactions as we saw in the Lotke-Volterra example. Other demos are already there as well. And here is some example of patterns. So instead of looking at this, perhaps it's best if I show it to you like that. So you can see how the system starts and forms such a pattern. New cells, kind of spots, are formed, and they divide, and so on. So let's stop here. Now this is the code, the Python code of the Gray-Scott demo. So we have the chemical reactions as we had for the Lotke-Volterra's example. And then we just set a reaction diffusion system with a grid of a size that we determine. And we deposit some substances and integrate the system for a number of time steps. And you can animate it using VPython, which is what I used for the animation I showed to you before. This one, this is on top of a VPython. Okay, as conclusions, now I gave a very brief summary of artificial chemistries with a few examples that I don't claim that these examples are in any way representative of artificial chemistries in general. Many more artificial chemistries exist. Our book contains almost 1,000 citations, and of course it's not one-to-one, but we estimate that maybe hundreds of artificial chemistries exist. But what can we learn from artificial chemistries? Are they just toy chemistries? I think three aspects can be highlighted here. First, an engineering approach, how to build things, learn by building them, and we hope that our software package will facilitate this practice and experimentation with new artificial chemistries. A second aspect is that artificial chemistries are a natural way of performing emergent computation. There is no way around it in artificial chemistries. So it makes this emergent aspect much more clear and worth exploring. And another third aspect, which I think deserves more attention, which unfortunately I didn't have time to speak much about it today, is to understand emergent phenomena, like to formal approaches to artificial chemistries like chemical organization theory and others. In our book we have an introduction to most of these formal approaches, but I think much more can be done with that to understand how systems work. In the future, I think there is still a challenge to have the artificial chemistries field, to bring it to a discipline. What is really the discipline of artificial chemistries? The field is not sufficiently mature yet. The borders are still not clearly delimited. There is no coherent big picture. And we still have to explore a lot of common aspects between these emergent phenomena, which is a challenge that we share with complex systems research, and how to compute with self-organization and emergence, and how to steer that, how to move upwards in complexity, how to encapsulate the acquired emergent properties. I think this is one of the main challenges that we still don't know how to deal with. And in the future, I would like to see a lot more interdisciplinarity, like hybrid systems that mix the wet and the virtual, or wet and electronics, And then perhaps seamless programming, like how to program artificial chemistries in a way that both the wet and say simulated computation models look a little bit similar. Okay, that was it. Thank you very much. And I'm ready for questions.